Okay, the Water Quality Management Committee meeting Thursday, November 16th, 2017 will come to order. I would like to start by recognizing the friendly delegation from Great Harbors, some of whom have taken my request seriously about moving forward, and the others are invited to move forward. I used to do that when I was in college and sit in the back and hope they would notice me. This isn't college. I guess that's as close as we're going to get. As you were well aware, the first item on the agenda is for the committee to discuss the draft scenario on achieving TMDL compliance in the Great Pond watershed. Before we do that, I'm going to give just a brief background piece because some of you may not have followed this with as much interest as we have. And I think it's worth sort of painting the picture here. Let me start first by having the committee introduce themselves.
Steve Layton.
Virginia Valiela, Vice Chair.
Eric Turkington.
Tom Buckham.
And we have a couple of other members who aren't with us yet or aren't with us today, but usually they're set up. And that's Sia Karplus, who is our consultant. The picture that I'm going to paint here, it started about 10 years ago. The town was being instructed by the DEP and the EPA and everybody else to do something about its impaired estuaries. Falmouth has more estuaries than any other town in Cape Cod. And we have more impaired estuaries than any other town on Cape Cod. 40% of all the impaired estuaries in Massachusetts are in Falmouth. And impaired means obviously what you think it means, that instead of having clear water and the species that you want to see in your water bodies, you have cloudy water, you have all kinds of black muck, you have green algae, you have all kinds of undesirable species. And this town wanted to do something about it. The first thing that happened is that we had a consultant who came up with a plan that said basically sewer everything south of Route 28 from Moore Point all the way to Falmouth Harbor. And when you're done with that, sewer some more north of 28. And the price tag for that proposal was $600 million. The town said, you got to be kidding. We're not doing that. So the town set up a review committee and then later this water quality committee. And our instruction was, look at every option besides sewering. Look at sewering too, but look at every option there is for cleaning up these estuaries. Figure out what they would cost, how hard they are to do, would the public do them, how would they be implemented, and give us direction on where to go, because every estuary is going to be different, and the solution for every estuary is going to be different. So this town and this committee entered into what was basically a pioneering effort to look at different kinds of ways to deal with nitrogen in the watersheds. We looked at eco toilets, we looked at innovative alternative septic systems, and by look at, I don't mean we just hired a consultant and wrote a report. We put these things in the ground. We put these things in people's houses. We studied before what the nitrogen output was and after what the nitrogen output was. The whole premise was there must be ways to reduce nitrogen besides sewering, and we're going to find out what they are and what they cost. We looked at fertilizer reduction. The town passed a bylaw that said you can't fertilize at all within 100 feet of an estuary. Toughest bylaw in the state. We've studied black muck removal. We've studied inlet opening. It's a very important one. Flushing has a lot to do with the quality of the water. Shellfish propagation. I'm sure you've seen some of that going on. We figured out how to grow oysters by the millions, how to make them do their job. We figured out how much nitrogen they take out, and we know the pros and the cons of that process. Permeable reactive barriers. Nobody knew what they were, but we are going to put one in this town. It'll be another way to see what works and what doesn't. And sewering. As you know, we did a sewering project in Little Pond. And that too is an experiment because we're going to find out if sewering takes out the kind of nitrogen that it's supposed to take out. So the 15 estuaries that we have here start in the Gansett, and there's Fiddler's Cove, And there's Rand's Canal. This is all on the Buzzards Bay side. There's Wild Harbor, West Falmouth Harbor. We've got Quistit Harbor. We've got Oyster Pond. We've got Salt Pond. We've got Falmouth Inner Harbor. We've got Little Pond. We've got Great Pond. We've got Green Pond. We've got Bowens Pond. We've got Eel Pond. We've got Wacoit Bay. And as you can see, all those lines that are attached to those water bodies are the areas of contribution. And a drop of water that goes on the ground in any of those territories ends up in that estuary. 3/4 of the people who live in this town live in an area that contributes to one of the estuaries. Their nitrogen is our nitrogen. So we've had spent some time in the last couple of years going estuary by estuary and applying each of these options that we've developed and see which ones would be appropriate or affordable or effective or all three. And the short story is the big enchilada is Great Pond, and we'll show you why. This is a measurement of the amount of nitrogen that has to be removed for each estuary to be at the level where it can be healthy again. And as you can see, you start back there first. You're starting off in Narragansett and Wild Harbor. These are the ones along the west coast in Buzzards Bay. They don't have a lot of nitrogen, and they can be reasonably removed without sewering because we have options that will work on a small scale. In Little Pond, we've done the sewering for Little Pond, and that's going to take care of that. Here's Great Pond. As you can see, the level of nitrogen in Great Pond is way higher than any of these others over here. Now, there's also Green Pond has some, Bowens Pond has some, Eel Pond has some, and Wacoit Bay goes through the roof. Wacoit Bay we share with Mashpee, and a good deal of the problem in Wacoit Bay is being caused by Mashpee and is being addressed by Mashpee. So that one is not entirely ours to deal with. Great Pond, even though the zone of contribution is huge, almost all of it's in Falmouth, so it really is ours to deal with. So we're as I said, today's conversation is going to be what options do we have in Great Pond, and as you can see, what we're up against. It's unlikely to be solved with most of the alternatives we looked at, and that's what the conversation today is about. Sewering obviously is an option, and it's going to be on the table to discuss. If there were going to be sewering, it would have many, many steps to go before anything happens. This committee has to recommend it. The DEP has to agree that it's going to be done. The EPA has to be on board. The Board of Selectmen have to want to do it. The Finance Committee has to want to do it. The town meeting has to want to do it. The voters of the town of Falmouth have to want to do it. It's got a long path to go before anything happens. One thing we've learned in our process here is you don't go to the voters and say, we want to raise your taxes. So we look around for time frames. When is old debt, like for schools and things, when is that being paid off so that there's a window for new debt? And that window is when we would want to go to the town and say, here's a project, here's what it's going to cost. It won't raise your taxes. So that next window won't be until 2025. So any of you who are worried about anything happening in the next 6 or 7 years can stop worrying about that. The other piece of it, obviously, the town will pay its share, but the homeowners will pay theirs too. And there's no way of telling right now how much it could possibly be. There's been no plans done, no one has any idea what area would be sewered. I will tell you our experience in the Heights in Mara Vista was after the town ended up paying its share, the homeowners ended up paying their share turned out to be $13,000 per household. And they got to pay it off over 30 years at 0%, which meant that their annual betterment was $430 a year. which is probably the lowest betterment in the history of the world, certainly in Massachusetts. So Falmouth can do things right, and Falmouth did that right. Now, there's no guarantee that if we do sewering in Great Pond, that it would be that number. But everything we would do in the next 5 years would be to make sure it's the lowest number it could possibly be. And, so that's the Cliff's Notes version of what we've been doing here for the last 6 or 7 years. And now you can watch us in action, such as it is. When the action is over, we would be very happy to have a conversation with any of you about any questions you might have.
Can we ask questions as we go along, or do you want to wait until the end of the meeting?
I want to make a suggestion. There are only 10 slides for the presentation, and so I think it would be good for you to see the whole presentation, and then we can easily flip back to any slide that...
I just have one quick question. This is obviously a snapshot of the nitrogen levels. When was this taken? How?
All the nitrogen levels, and this is a measure of how much needs to be removed for the water body to get to health. These numbers are based on Mass Estuaries Project studies, which were done for each estuary in different years. The Great Pond one, do we have a year on when that was done?
So the Great Pond actual report came out in 2006, but we did an update in 2012. We did a historic update of data up to 2012. So these are target removal numbers. They're not nitrogen concentrations. They're not load numbers. If you look at what is called a total maximum daily load, which is a regulatory requirement to get the estuary back to health, these are planning numbers. So in the thousands, we're talking about in the 12,000 or so kilograms. And from looking at the Mass Estuaries Project report to that was completed in 2006 to the 2012 update, the water quality hadn't changed. So it's likely that these numbers are appropriate still for planning purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go through 10 slides. I'm Steve Hartless, technical consultant, and I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what that document, that Massachusetts Estuaries Project report, says about Great Pond and what it then tells us about our requirements for bringing that estuary back to health.
Before you start, can everybody see this?
See, I think it needs a little bit of focus. And do you want me to turn that light on?
I went for the lights with FCTV,
Yeah.
and they like it.
They want the lights on?
They want the lights on so that our nationwide viewing audience will be able to see.
Oh, fair enough.
Very cool.
Oh, okay.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is what we typically do is try to frame the estuary and the watershed. This is just our first photograph. It's an aerial view. And what it really is there to show us is the level of development. There's clearly dense development around Great Pond. There's also dense development around Jenkins Pond and some of the other ponds, and along Route 28 going into some of the neighborhoods off of Route 28. A better view, although not as great without the lights off, is this. This is the technical map of what is known as the Great Pond watershed. So here's Coonamessett Pond, here's Jenkins Pond, here's Perch Pond, here's Route 28, just to try to give some aerial context. But this estuary goes all the way up into Sandwich, is mostly in the town of Falmouth, but it's long and it's wide. So there's a great area of contribution. This map is also in the Mass Estuaries report, and that's available online. But I think what's important to understand here is that there's this big external red line, which is the watershed proper, but there are these sub areas, and I want to just point these out. Here's Great Pond itself. This little teardrop is considered the Perch Pond sub-watershed. These two areas that kind of feed into Perch Pond are considered the Great Pond, Perch Pond sub-watershed. So some of the water goes directly into Perch Pond and some goes directly into Great Pond in over 10 years of travel time. So it takes a lot longer. This kind of a heart shape, if you take this polygon and you take out Perch Pond, is what is considered going directly into Great Pond from surrounding properties. So all of the properties that surround Great Pond and on half of the Acapesket Peninsula, because the other half goes into Great Pond. As you can see, this is sort of a dividing line.
Into Green Pond.
Thank you, into Green, well, half of it goes into Great Pond and the other half goes into Green Pond, thank you. And then this very large area, polygon, is considered the Coonamessett River sub-watershed, and that's all of the area of contribution that goes into the Coonamessett River from this upper watershed. So that's just so that as we start talking more technically about kilograms to be removed, these are the sub-areas that we're going to be looking at. And we can go back to these. What we did is we took a look at, anecdotally, you can look at these two maps and say there's some density of development in different areas. But we then took a little more analytical look and went with GIS and said how many lots are smaller than 8,000 feet, 8,000 square feet, how many are between 8,000 and 10,000 square feet, how many are between 10 and 15,000 square feet. And so we got ourselves a picture that I think speaks volumes about the level of density. So the red are lots that are less than 8,000 square feet, and then the blue are between 8 and 10, and then the yellow are 15 or under. But as you can see from how much of this lower watershed is colored, and some of the upper watershed around Jenkins Pond, there's quite small lots in much of this watershed. So lots of small lots.
Let me just interject that two things that make that important to know. If you're sewering, small lots and lots of them make the per house cost much less. That's one factor. The other factor is small lots mean innovative alternative systems that you would install next as part of your septic tank. You don't have room for them on small lots, so it is not necessarily an available option.
Right, and as an example of that, this red sort of semi-triangle is the Little Pond area that was sewered as part of the Little Pond project. So this whole area has already been sewered, and you can see exactly what Chairman Turkington was saying, small lots and a very low betterment. How do we know anything? So that's sort of a picture of the land use, land development, density of development, and a look at the watershed. Let's look at a second for the water. How do we know anything about the quality of the water, what needs to be done, where did all this come from? Well, the Massachusetts Estuaries Project is a joint effort of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Environmental Protection, and the UMass Dartmouth School for Marine Science and Technology. And they've been actually collecting data since the 90s in Great Pond. And the stations, what are known as GT1, 2, 3, starting right there at 28, at the intersection of Route 28 and where the Coonamessett River comes in, down to G2, G3, which is sort of heading, people who live in this area call this the Coonamessett River still. Some do, some do. I've heard when we talk about aquaculture, some people call this the river. But so G1 and G2 and G3 are sort of in that river part of Great Pond. We then have one station in Perch Pond, one in the middle of the pond, which is considered the barometer for the entire system. So when you look at water quality indicators at this particular station, GT5, that gives you a read for how the entire estuary is functioning in terms of nitrogen concentration and dissolved oxygen, other indicators of health. And then there's one station near the inlet. So for years, we have a data set that goes back from the 90s, decades of fairly rigorous measurements, both lab and field samples. And so from that, we are able to look at the concentration of nitrogen. And nitrogen is our sort of indicator that we look at, the nitrogen concentration, because the nitrogen concentration really tells us what is happening with algae, what is happening with dissolved oxygen. It gives us a very good look. And if your nitrogen is too high, then you're going to wind up with the kinds of unpleasant side effects of anoxic events and fish kills and all the stuff that we really don't want. I want to point out that even though there's a bunch of this that is blue, blue is not good enough. The actual station, the actual concentration of nitrogen wants to be 0.4. And so if you have this blue, the dark blue, you're looking good. But even this sort of bluey green is still above that concentration. And you can see at our Sentinel station, which is really at Oak Street and Joy Street if you live in the area, we have a long way to go to get to that water quality. You'll also notice, and one of our members was really quick to point this out, that we have much worse water quality in the upper reaches of Perch Pond, in the upper reaches of Great Pond, and the concentrations are much higher because obviously there's flushing that happens at the lower end, at the inlet. And this particular inlet is not occluded in any way. In other words, the tide on the outside of the sound is this tide that goes into Great Pond, and so there's not any kind of a dampening of the tide as far as up as it goes, which is about a third of the way. So the other thing the Mass Estuaries Project does very well is evaluates the sources. So where is this nitrogen coming from? And the story here is the story that we've seen in the other 10 estuaries we've looked at recently, and in every other estuary in the town of Falmouth. It comes from us. We've met the enemy, and we are the enemy in terms of nitrogen in estuaries. 70% of the load is coming from septic systems. And if you think of it in terms of what load you control, which is everything but what falls from rain, 82% is coming from the septic systems. And the other two sources, stormwater runoff, is 9%, so a small fraction, and fertilizer is about 7%, so the fertilizer we put on our lawns. And Falmouth, as Chairman Turkington mentioned, has a bylaw that prohibits using fertilizer within 100 feet of an estuary. So we believe that we've actually taken care of that, a percentage of that input, by helping people, encouraging people, and actually requiring people to reduce their fertilizer use. So knowing what we know, which is we have a problem, it's a source problem mostly from our septic systems, we then want to understand how much of a problem is it. And the Mass Estuaries Project uses two models, RMA2 and RMA4, and they're able to take the concentrations and the measured concentrations and run a model that says, we know what the current loading is, what do we need to get to in the future to bring the actual water concentration to an acceptable level. And so when they run that model, they produce a table that tells us the load is presently 25 kilograms per day in that Great Pond sub-watershed, needs to get to 3, which is a huge difference. You know, how many kilograms is that? And so we do some simple arithmetic, and we're able to get, for the Great Pond main sub-watershed that we showed you earlier, and the Perch Pond sub-watershed, and the Coonamessett River, an amount of nitrogen, kilograms of nitrogen per year, that we need to stop from going into that system so that the concentration at that Sentinel station will bring us back to health. 2 more slides. The total is huge. The total is 12,000 kilograms of nitrogen. And I think it's worth noting briefly that the sources are 9,000 kilograms are coming from Great Pond, 2,000 or so kilograms are coming from Perch Pond, and 8,200 are coming right from that Coonamessett River. The Coonamessett River itself is a very big source, which is what we're up against. So we take all of that information, all of that understanding, all of that scientific research, and we think about how do you remove 12, we do our math. We say you've got 12,000 kilograms to remove. How can we do it? And we try to use all of the alternatives that we've been studying for 5 or so years first. And then when we haven't, and then see where we are. And so what this table shows us is if we take 25% of the entire fertilizer load, we believe that's what our bylaw gets us, and DEP and Cape Cod Commission have said as much. We get about 400 kilograms. All right, we're starting up the hill. Stormwater, we feel that there are stormwater remediation that we could implement and get another 25% of that stormwater load. We sewered some of Great Pond when we did the Little Pond sewer, so we take credit for that as well, and that was about 1,400 kilograms worth of nitrogen that came from that peninsula that I showed you. And then we've got shellfish, and because we have an aquaculture plan that has looked very specifically at how much shellfish aquaculture could go into Great Pond, we have a number for how much shellfish could be grown, including cohogs that would be bottom planted as well as some floating gear. Some credit for the denitrification that we believe will happen as part of that activity. And then we looked at a PRB, which would capture some of Homestead Lane, which I have a slide to show, but it hasn't gone through. We have a subcommittee for PRBs, but this is just our first cut at, could there be a PRB that might reduce some of the nitrogen? Clearly, we're leaving no stone unturned in this realm of alternatives, and we still have 8,000 kilograms we need to remove. Practically speaking, I mean, these are optimistic numbers, but they're what I like to think about is the practical end of optimistic, with the shellfish and the PRB and the fertilizer and the stormwater. So we still have 8,000 kilograms to remove, and when you look at that, when we looked at that, we thought, well, let's figure out how many innovative alternative septic systems that would mean, or how many sewered parcels. And so what we've got is about 2,000 parcels would have to install best-in-class nitrogen-removing septic systems, or about 1,500 parcels would need to be sewered. And that would get us the amount of nitrogen out of the system to restore Great Pond. And with that, we're going to open it up to questions.
Okay.
All right, I'm
Sure.
going to write them down.
Great Pond is the big polluter here. Why didn't we start with Great Pond? Why didn't we start where we live and not Mara Vista, where the Great Pond is the worst of all?
Well,
You'll need to repeat the question.
you know, I get it. He was asking, why wasn't Great Pond the first estuary attacked instead of the Little Pond? Frankly, the short answer is Little Pond was, as sewering goes, was low-hanging fruit. It was close to the town infrastructure as far as being able to hook up. It was as dense or more than Great Pond. We could capture 90% of the nitrogen that Little Pond needed to have captured by sewering 1,400 homes, whereas the payback would not be as good in Great Pond. And there's sort of a logic to the existing town sewer system. Starts in Woods Hole, runs along the bike path, and goes down Main Street. It goes up Davis Straits now, but that structure was in place. So the idea of heading east in one estuary at a time made some sense. Little Pond was the first one you'd get to, and then obviously Great Pond's the next.
And I would just add one more historical note to that, because I was a commissioner of public works in the early 80s when the first part of the sewer was installed, and it was originally proposed to be a two-phase. So it was Main Street, certain places along Surf Drive, and places in Woods Hole. And the next portion was to be Mara Vista and Falmouth Heights. All of these projects have to go through town meeting, and the town meeting members from those areas remember what the town's plan was. So that sort of was part of how you move from a concept to finally to a reality. We have to be faithful to the things that were earlier discussed 3 decades ago with the residents of that area.
Sure. Mr. Brown, and by the way, we have Selectman Brown, who I would like to have sit up here so he can take the slings and arrows too.
Hi, Doug Brown. So I have 2 questions. One is, now that our sewer treatment plant is performing as it should, any hope for us to get maybe some increased discharge to potentially use to mitigate this 1,500 homes? Is there ever any hope for that?
What's the second question?
Second question is, what's the status of the PRB that we're hoping to put in?
Okay.
The discharge issue is a very big one. Right now, the wastewater from the sewer areas goes to the plant up in West Falmouth, and it gets treated to 3 parts per what they milliliter. Per 3 parts per million, which is the EPA drinking water standard is 10 parts per million. So it is really well treated. It still has to go into the ground somewhere, and it finds its way through the ground to West Falmouth Harbor. In fact, the fact that when it wasn't treated very well earlier is one reason why West Falmouth Harbor has as much pollution as it has. But the point he raises is very good. Any further sewering project is going to have to find a discharge means It may be a new location, it may be a different way of discharging, it may go someplace else. We're looking at sites and means for discharge, but before there's gonna be a sewer plan, there's gotta be a sewer discharge plan. You're absolutely right.
And so I'm the pond watcher on that estuary, and thanks to my neighbor Charlie Haley for doing it for 17 years before he conned me into taking over. But it's important stuff. What about the PRV? Do you think that'll be coming along soon?
The town applied for a grant to construct 200 feet of PRB at a town-owned parcel at the intersection of Shorewood Drive and Route 28. We're still waiting for the state to announce the award of that. Shouldn't be much longer, but,
But it seems like it'll be going forward.
well, we don't know. We're waiting for the announcement of the rewards.
Okay.
It might help if you have a brief explanation of what PRBs are all about.
Eh,
We're used to all the acronyms, but
Yes, we are, and I apologize.
Doug, are you gonna, join us up here, or you wanna hide back there?
Are you serious?
Of course I'm serious.
There's even an extra microphone. PRB stands for Permeable Reactive Barrier. It is a technology that has been used extensively across the country for several decades for remediation of groundwater, particularly for industrial contamination of groundwater. It basically is an injection or installation of chemicals. Sometimes it's iron filings. It's now, in the more modern parlance, it's actually a vegetable oil. But what it does is provide the carbon that is missing in the groundwater for a denitrification process to take place. We've selected a parcel where the groundwater is close enough to the surface where we could, as a trial project, inject this vegetable oil and then monitor to see if, in fact, there actually is a cleansing of the aquifer. It requires monitoring wells upstream so that you know the concentration of the nitrate in the groundwater, and then obviously downstream to see that if the nitrate has been removed. One of the big questions is how long will the injected vegetable oil last? 5 years, 10 years? When do you have to re-inject? So for this particular application for removal of nitrate that comes from septic systems, this is a new aspect, you might say, to this particular industry.
Sir.
I'm a little bit confused. We talk about Great Pond. When we talk about that, are we just talking about that central piece of the pond, or are we talking about all of the contributing estuaries that go with it? Because it seems to me we're talking about effluent that comes down this way, and whatever we do to the body of Great Pond, you're still going to have that same problem with everything that flows to it. And I'm wondering about also this 1,500 homes. We've got to be talking about both sides of the pond.
Yes.
In terms of how we look at sewering.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Sia, could
I
you?
was just gonna do that. Which one do you want?
Yeah, with Belmont.
There we go.
Okay, so Great Pond is the water body. This is the Great Pond. It includes Perch Pond, and it includes Great Pond, the main basin, and what goes up to Route 28.
Okay,
So that is called Great Pond.
okay, now go past
Up here,
20, up in there,
that's considered the Coonamessett River,
okay.
but it is the Great Pond watershed.
Yeah.
So you have a water body that is the Great Pond that goes up to Route 28 and then over includes Perch Pond. But as we said, when a drop of water falls here, it goes into the ground, and the groundwater goes into the pond. Sometimes it's through the Coonamessett River, sometimes it's directly there. So any solution for removing the source of nitrogen is going to have to address as much of the estuary as is necessary to get that 1,500 homes. Does that clarify your question?
Yeah, to some extent, because you're saying as much as necessary. And
Well, that's why, I mean, you wouldn't remove a source, if you need to remove 1,500 homes worth or 8,000 kilograms worth, you wouldn't remove 12,000 kilograms because you don't have to do that much. You would just remove as much nitrogen as a source input as necessary.
Sure.
Yeah, I read the Massachusetts Estuary Project report. In fact, I read it twice to be sure I could understand it, because there's some conflicting data in there in terms of the models. But I also read the summary, the executive summary that you guys put together of the 3 ponds. So it seems to me, if you look at the last table of your executive summary of Green, Great, and Bullen's Pond, I wouldn't say that, I think it's a misnomer to say that the Great Pond is the worst of the 3. In fact, in terms of remediation of the nitrogen, Bullen's Pond is the worst, because you need to remove 75% of the nitrogen to get that down to a level of 0.45, which is actually not as strict a level as 0.4, which you've set for Great Pond. But if you look at the levels, and where your Sentinel, where the
Sentinel Station.
the Estuaries Project Sentinel node is, it's not really in the center of Great Pond. It's way up, almost where the 2 Perch Pond and the upper arm, as it's called, meet. And the reason that that is higher and a sort of bluish-greenish color on your color chart is because it's getting fed from those 2 arms.
Absolutely.
So if you look at Great Pond, which has the best tidal flow of all 3, and the best depth of all 3, and the most water of all 3 ponds, you could argue, I think pretty effectively, that if you, and you don't know yet the full extent of the value of the Perch Pond sewering, because that can lower,
Little Pond.
it can help Perch Pond a lot more than these data.
Right.
No, Perch Pond.
But we haven't done
Perch Pond is
that.
the arm.
It
It
that's
does
not.
have sewering.
No.
No.
Little Pond.
No, Little Pond.
Let's get the map back up.
I'm going to show the map. The
It
Perch
has
Pond.
Little Pond project.
So if you look at this, the Perch Pond sub-embayment is not affected by the Little Pond sewering project. The removal from the Little Pond sewering project addresses the Great Pond sub-embayment. Perch Pond,
Here's the Little Pond project. Here's Perch Pond.
Right,
The sewering stopped here.
okay.
So Perch Pond is receiving no
Yeah.
benefit at all from any
Right,
sewering.
okay.
no.
All right, I stand corrected. So it just seems to me, if you look at the levels, if we just focus now on Great Pond and forget about the fact that I really believe that Bullen's Pond is actually just as bad in terms of needing.
Right, that's,
Okay, actually, you're not wrong about Bourne's Pond, but Bourne's Pond has an answer that gets rid of half of the nitrogen without any sewering, because opening that
Yes,
channel up
yes, I
gets
understand
rid
it.
of, so that.
Well, you can put shellfish in there, you can
Right,
enhance
no,
the
understood. No,
opening.
that's why we're saying we have a solution for Bourne's Pond that does not involve sewering, because inlet opening does so much for Bourne's Pond. Your inlet is wide open now, so there's no gain to be had there.
And I think we should point out further that both town meeting and the voters have already funded the widening for Bourne's Ponds, $5.5 million project, and it's in the permitting process now. So the town recognized that there was something that we could do right away, and so we're in the process of doing it. So
right,
Great
so-
Pond really is the next
Okay,
target.
All right, so we have other projects underway in town, particularly the Coonamessett River Bog renewal project.
Restoration.
Which everybody is hoping will really help the nitrogen level, because that's one of the 2 main factors: the sewerage, the septic system from the homes, and the amount that's being carried in from the Coonamessett River, 8,000,
right.
is huge.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so if you go ahead and the Boggs project is successful, which it certainly will know the answer to that before 2025, we'll have some facts there But the other thing is,
Well,
if you
just,
look
and I
at
just
the...
want to, just parenthetically, the next item on the agenda is a discussion of the monitoring that is hopefully going to be done, is being done, and will continue to be done, so that we can actually quantify what that restoration, because it is a big question. I think if you ask the scientists, are you going to see a nitrogen removal? The answer is, we don't know yet. But we certainly are going to make sure we can find out. So that is absolutely.
We have two of the world famous experts on this subject, and particularly on the Coonamessett River, who are the next item here.
On the
So
agenda.
if you get tired of hearing the subject matter and want to hear theirs, just stick around.
If you look at the nitrogen levels in Great Pond,
Yeah.
starting from the inlet and going north,
Sure.
the levels are fine. They're 0.4 or below until you get to within, a few thousand yards of the Sentinel's node station there. And it seemed to me that because it's coming in from the Coonamessett River and because it's heading towards the ocean, you're going to get all that. The reason that it's not purple is because it doesn't get the tidal flow and it's getting the nitrogen. If you took a station 4 is below that.
Yep.
Station 4 was good.
Mhm.
So it seems to me if you sewered just the two inlets, Perch Pond, all the homes there, the upper part there, you did the Coonamessett River Bog Renewal Project, you put in the semi-permeable barrier at 28, I believe, and you have to take into account that by 2025, we'll probably have a foot and a half higher tides than we do today, okay? Because 2050 and 2080.
Wow.
Everybody knows the story with 2050 and 2080, okay? We don't even want to, my grandkids have already been primed on that. So I think that it's not really, in my opinion, it's not necessary to sewer all of the homes along the whole extent of lower Great Pond.
You could be right, and this committee is nowhere near deciding what to recommend by way of sewering, but I think the concept that you've put out here, it reflects the thinking that we have been following, sort of, that the northern sections, you get a bigger bang for the buck there. Steve,
And you have somebody on the committee, namely me, who totally agrees with you. In fact, I think the slide that showed the lot sizes was unfortunate because it implies to a lot of people that that's where the sewers go. But no one said where the sewers go, and if anyone said they go there, I was going to say exactly what you just said.
Yep.
That, for instance, it's obvious that down near the mouth, there's absolutely no point in having sewers. And up at the top, you get 100% return on your investment. And
Well, that's why I
there's a
think
gradation from
there's
one to
some
the other.
disconnect, because I didn't
And then
know.
a related question is, if you did sue, and Sia didn't say they were going there. She just has, it's just a back of the envelope calculation that 1,465 sewers, in theory, would do it, if they were in the right place. You could totally waste them by putting them all along Vineyard Sound. And the other thing is, if you did just solve the problem at the Sentinel Station, is the town willing to let Perch Pond stay red?
Or ugly green.
Well, I think Perch Pond would be part of that northern section that made the most sense
Well,
to source reduce
You get the
from.
gist
You
of
might put the sewers there first.
of
Right.
the issue here, okay? You're right where the committee is right now.
Exactly,
So-
right where we are.
Right, you have to start with the big picture and understand where your sources are and what your planning problem is, which is, 8,000 kilograms or more. And then you say, what makes the most sense in terms of location, right? That's the,
Lady in the back.
Hi, I've got two questions. One's on Bones Pond and one's on fertilizer.
Do you think you could get to a microphone so that our nationwide TV audience could hear you?
And maybe give us your name.
It's
Ann
on.
Costello, can you hear?
Thank you.
Two questions. One is on Bourne's Pond. The first question is, years ago, they closed part of Bourne's Pond where the water went out. It used to go underneath that old wooden bridge. And now they're talking about widening the opening. Why was that ever closed?
God closed it. God closed it with a lot of sand, and it just remained closed so often that it became quite clear it was not a functioning opening.
Because that's helped create a problem.
No, actually, there
Because
was a
that-
problem and it was getting worse. I was a selectman in 1986,
Okay.
and that's the time George Souza was our shellfish warden at that time, and that's when the town meeting and the town made the decision. That entrance repeatedly closed and had become too narrow. When you look historically at the maps, the entrance is about 100 feet wide. And George Souza proposed that the entrance where it is now is the actual original location of the entrance to Bourne's Pond, and that it be 100 feet. There was a lot of contention during the permitting process, and the state only allowed us to do 50 feet. It should have been 100. And so we are now, it's now going to be 90. But you know, that's the way things go. Maybe sea level rise will take care of the other 10 feet. Who knows? But in any case, that's the answer. It's in an original location now. It is not as wide as it should be, and that's why the tide is retarded, held back, and widening it will improve that.
Okay. And my second question was on fertilizing. Someone had mentioned, I think it was Eric mentioned, you can't fertilize the first 100 feet into the water. How has Falmouth notified homeowners about this, and how do you monitor it?
Every single homeowner who owns a piece of land within 100 feet of the saltwater estuary gets a letter every year from the town saying, you are not allowed to fertilize there, and if you are, you're in violation of a town bylaw. The enforcement piece, I will say, could be improved, but we send that letter out every year, and we are confident that a good many homeowners follow that bylaw.
And it's complaints-driven enforcement, just like everything else in the town of Falmouth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have a neighbor with a shiny green lawn,
Speak to the peer pressure is important.
But if you look at the numbers, even if you had 200% enforcement, you'd still need other. It's still a small potato.
yes, please.
Have we been able to measure what benefit Title V has been to the area?
As far as nitrogen removal?
Pardon?
As far
Yes.
as, none.
None. Doesn't.
None, we've measured. It does nothing for nitrogen.
Okay.
Sure.
It sounds like you're talking different options and understanding the problem, and are not at a point where you're actually recommending a specific solution or group of solutions. So this is in the evaluative period. Is
Yes.
that correct?
This presentation today is sort of the rollout of the first time we've looked at Great Pond with the point of view of saying, we know what's in our toolbox, we know what nitrogen has to go, what can we do here that's going to work? And you're watching it today.
So it sounds like you don't yet know, for example, the benefit or impact of sewering in the Little Pond area, which boundaries on Great Pond.
A very good point. We view the Little Pond effort as another demonstration project, in that if the nitrogen in that pond doesn't go down substantially, sewering may not be such a hot option either. We don't know that.
Right.
And could I just further comment on that? So that's a very obvious question. Did the sewers actually help us with Little Pond and maybe to some degree Great Pond? And so the U.S. Geological Survey has a research project going on in Mara Vista, and they are very carefully monitoring the groundwater at multiple, we call them transects, from all the way from one side of the peninsula to the other in several places and at several depths. And they started that monitoring before the sewers went in. We are keeping them posted as the houses get hooked up. And then we will have, obviously, post-sewer information. You always have to factor in the fact that the groundwater moves at a steady rate, and obviously groundwater that is farther inland will take longer with its load of nitrogen to reach Little Pond. The data that I've seen indicate that for Mara Vista, if you go to the very center of the peninsula, the height of it's 7 years. So and because they put so many monitoring wells in, we have a band where it only takes a year to get to Little Pond and then 2 years to get to Little Pond. So I think we have a very credible scientific group looking at this very question, and we'll all be interested in the results.
And it sounds like you're not going to know that answer till at least a year or two from now.
I would say so, a year or two from now.
Maybe more, because, we found in West Falmouth, when the plant was upgraded and it went down to 3 parts per million, the hope was that within 7 to 10 years, this new clean bulge of water would hit West Falmouth Harbor, and the water quality would start to improve. It's taken a lot longer, we found, for that bulge to actually get to West Falmouth Harbor than anybody thought.
Yeah.
One other question, I'm sorry. Given that the body of water is not of an equal depth, so the flow is somewhat here and there, is there any option also on the table for dredging way up and try and clean out a pathway so you get that motion throughout the body of water?
That won't change it.
No, you would just have,
The flow is going to be the same. There isn't a dam that's stopping the flow coming from the west. The input flow.
Right.
You can't increase that
He's
by
talking about
opening.
tidal flow coming in.
But
I'm not
he's
saying
talking
that's-
about upstream.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's the only solution, but if your source is further north and you don't give it a good channel for volume motion to get all the way out to the ocean, it's going to be a trickle.
It's not, though.
well.
Probably not.
Yeah, well, you're doing what's called increasing the tidal prism, the volume of water that's moved.
No, he's talking about the river.
I know.
He's hoping to increase the river flow by making the river bigger, and that doesn't happen.
No, I think he's talking about the upper parts of Great Pond.
The upper parts
Yeah,
of Great
below-
Pond.
Below 28.
Of the pond.
So
itself.
increase the water, you're increasing the volume of water. A couple things you're up against. The tidal variation at the mouth of Great Pond is remarkably small because of the physics of the tidal movements on outside in the sounds. And you would increase the flow rate at the inlet itself because more water is being moved back and forth a little bit.
No, it wouldn't. Actually, you'd prefer for it to be completely shallow. If it was so shallow that, like the Bay of Fundy, it completely emptied out and then came in again. And just think about washing the dishes, right? Or washing out of glass or something. You want to empty it and then refill it. That would be ideal, but that's not going to happen. But making it deeper actually means that the percentage change gets smaller.
Right.
But one thing that would be helpful would be to excavate some of the black muck that's in that dead area, because it continues to decompose.
Right.
And there's no
Yes.
life there anyway.
And that's the hardest part for us to quantify is what's called the benthic flux, the nitrogen that's moving in and out of the bottom. That's the least known thing we have to deal with. If you look at any of our models, we've got kind of question marks over there with that part of it, because it's dark science.
So you could eliminate all new nitrogen coming in and not solve the problem.
No.
Because of what's
no.
already there in the
Yeah.
bottom.
No, the benthic flux is included in the estuaries report as either a source or a sink. And there are a few areas where, when they looked at the benthic, that whole benthic component, there was a plus N, if you will, from the benthic flux, but that's included in the model. And so those numbers that we're supposed to reduce from sources includes the fact that you've got a plus coming in from the benthic, and it's not a huge number, actually, in Great Pond. The benthic flux is really, it's not a positive. The benthos does not contribute nitrogen to the water column of Great Pond because of the biota.
Having said that, we did try an experiment last summer to try to make the black muck go away. And we haven't figured it out yet, but it's on our list of things to try to make happen.
And you know what the biggest thing we found from that study was? That the tide is so great that it's very hard, because what we were trying to do is oxygenate the sediment, that it was very hard to measure because the flow, the tide is huge coming in from the Coonamessett River and from the pond. So there's already a huge flow. So it's not stagnant at all up there.
I'm going to go back again to the monitoring of the Little Pond sewer.
Yeah.
Some of that Little Pond sewering helps Great Pond, right?
Yes,
Yeah, it was-
that's
1,200
the
kilograms.
Common sense thing of doing both sides of that peninsula.
That's correct.
Has anybody, is that monitoring going to include the effect on Great Pond? And has anybody figured out how many years it will take to take into account the transit time through the ground and the signal to noise problem in measuring in Great Pond?
I'll take a stab at parts of that.
I know.
USGS is gathering data. They're not saying, we're not gathering data so we can report on Little Pond or Great Pond. We're just going to tell you whether we see a decrease in the groundwater at this particular well. If it happens to be a well that's going to Great Pond, then we'll know that there's a benefit to Great Pond. They will be able to tell us, yes, the nitrogen signal has moved through, flushed out, and it'll be, 2 years or 5 years or whatever that is. Then we could, because we know the number of houses there, figure out what the actual nitrogen reduction was. SIA has figured out it in terms of benefit.
1,200 kilograms.
1,200 kilograms. So if it turns out the groundwater is clean, then the answer is 1,200 kilograms was removed from Great Pond. Will we see a difference in either the monitoring station, GT5, or the one farther south? Those are monitored every summer, as you know, for eight times in the summer. So we'll see whether we see anything after the flushing has completed.
So
So the
it
potential,
probably will have an effect, but it'll be theoretical. We won't know
Right.
for a lot
time.
of
You're right,
years.
the noise of
Well,
driving.
Noise.
we don't know.
I would say a foot a day, typical
That's
flow
right.
rate.
Yep.
And the houses that have been done as part of Little Pond project are very close to the shoreline.
Yeah.
So my guess is if there's going to be an effect, I would say we would certainly see it within 2 years and maybe already next year. I would say, that's my guess.
Except what we found with the oysters experiments in Little Pond and so on, is even though there are these singular numbers on all these tables and reports, if you look at the graphs, the variation from year to year is huge compared to the average. So you don't know from a given year's reading whether you've had any effect at all. You have to wait enough years to see if the average has changed.
Right.
So I'd just like to advocate again for some kind of immediate action for catching the road runoff, because I suspect actually in Perch Pond, it's a much higher percentage because of the confluence of roads. You've got Route 28 coming down to a low spot at the start of T-Ticket Path. And then T-Ticket Path dumps all that right into the end of Perch Pond. It's a perfect place for experimental bioswale or pollution control structure. And then if you look at the other side, it's coming back from the high part of T-Ticket Path and another housing development that's up there. So you got 3 huge dumps into Perch Pond. So I think if we could come up with a plan to start addressing the immediate road runoff without being asked by the state, just do it. By the time we start counting up where we're at, I think we're going to have to do another reevaluation in maybe 5 to 7 years as we're approaching the time to decide what's our next important infrastructure. I think we might have a lot more credit on our hands and have a smaller job ahead of us.
Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. We have had a preliminary conversation with Amy Lowell, and we're hoping to set up a meeting with the person in DPW that handles the drainage. And also, the selectmen are the Department of Public Works commissioners. And so if we need some push, I think it's an excellent idea.
Thank you.
We got one vote.
I'm going to vote twice.
Me too. Any other questions or comments?
I'm gathering that 2025 is more conceptual than it is targeted, or am I wrong?
I want to make a comment about that. the study committee that began to weigh in on this whole wastewater issue back in 2010, and that led to the creation of this committee, we're a standing committee made by town meeting, made several points. We're going to sewer as little as possible. We're going to look seriously at alternatives, improve them, and we're going to develop a financial plan that will help make it possible for this town, this community, these taxpayers to manage where we have these big capital projects. And so the year 2025 is a very important window. It's not theoretical. That is when we are paying off some fire stations in a school or something. And so we must do the planning within these next 7 years so that we are ready to have a town meeting vote followed by a ballot vote to bond for the next project. And I think this committee would not be doing its job if we did not help the community focus the conversation on a manageable project so that we make use of that window. We don't waste it.
And I also think it's important we point out that this is a very dynamic process, and we've got several arrows in our quivers for each of these estuaries, and if 3 or 4 years from now Bourne's Pond hasn't gotten any better, we have to go back and say, what are we going to do now? And we're taking that approach with each of the estuaries. We're not going to say, well, we're done with this, we're walking on to the next one. It's going to be monitored. The state has certain standards. The Sentinel stations, in most cases, someone's already remarked that while the Sentinel station is farther up Great Pond, every one of our estuaries has a Sentinel station. The state's standards implication are that if that station meets their standard, the estuary in general would be considered to be unimpaired or be high quality. And in most cases, because of the way these systems work, the Sentinel stations are up estuary, where the highest concentrations of nitrogen are. And you look at this, you'd say, well, yeah, a very substantial percentage of Great Pond looks pretty good. Why can't we just focus on that? And so that's the other thing that we're up against, is the state is looking for us to hit certain standards in the parts of the estuaries where they're going to be harder to hit. But with the idea that when those spots are clean, the overall estuary health is going to be good.
It has occurred to all of us that moving the Sentinel stations would be an easy win.
Yes, it would be. We could change the maps and get them to believe what we do.
We're actually lucky on this one.
Yeah.
Some of the, in one of the, at least one of the other ones, the Sentinel station is right in the middle of that red area.
Yeah, you had 3 plans, A, B, and C. And A is done, and B was the sewering of Great Pond there, and then C included a lot of other remediation as well. That was sort of like the ultimate. Everything was going to be, that we could do, would be done. And if you look at that, you still have terrible water quality in the upper arm of both Perch Pond and the finger of Great Pond. So with everything,
I don't either.
That's the estuaries project.
yeah, the estuaries project.
Well, that's
showed-
not us.
That's
That's
I
not us.
understand that, but I'm just saying, that project, which included sewering, and
Well, that was-
the sewering there was all 3 ponds. All, okay?
They ran
That's not a
And
plan.
I'm just saying, they still couldn't solve the issue
Right.
of those 2 bodies,
Right.
small bodies of water.
That is not a plan that anybody
Right.
here has had anything to do with.
But that's a classic pollution issue. As things get cleaner and cleaner, each remaining blob of pollutant, no matter what it is, gets more expensive to remove, almost always. And yeah, we could we could roll out a plan that would leave all of Falmouth's estuaries completely pristine, but I don't know whose pocketbook
Right.
we would drain to do that.
Not ours.
That was a $600 million plan 10 years ago. We're not doing that.
Is there any state or federal money that can be brought into these kinds of programs? Or is this all on us?
The best we get is a 0% loan from the state revolving fund. Back when we did the first iteration of the sewers in 1985, the state and the feds paid for 90% of it. And Falmouth should have done more then. But
Yeah. So should a lot of other towns.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, you're all, we're running out of questions, and you're all welcome to stay for the next piece, which is the Coonamessett River monitoring and which is obviously relevant to Great Pond. Happy to have you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
What do you give that
Thank you.
I was just curious, how does the
This guy should be on the committee.
get the sewage when it doesn't look like it's a big contributor? You look at those charts.
Well, that's perfect. Utah.
all the fish came out.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
It's so frustrating to go outside, it's pitch black. I just glanced out the window, you forget.
Ready when you are.
Should we close the door?
Just kick them out.
I just closed the doors.
He's not ready for anything this week.
Sure.
Yeah.
I noticed on one of the screens it had that most of the lots of Great Harbors were 3,000 square feet or less. The majority of them are 10,000 square feet. But the map looked like it was 8,000 or less.
What's the question?
All the white areas, I think, is bigger.
Yeah, the white area.
We can show you on the map.
I'm gonna give you, you can have a copy if you wanna dig into it a little bit more.
Does that have, yes it does. Red, less than 8,000.
Okay, all right.
Blue, bigger than 10,000.
Okay.
And then yellow.
Yeah, I think this looked different on the screen. Did it? Or was
That
it
should
like-
be what was up there, unless there's some weird optics in yours.
Yeah, no, because it.
No, the colors don't come through quite perfectly on the.
All right, a couple of people thought that too.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so now I'm good.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thanks.
You don't wanna
Thank
put
you.
this on your fridge.
No, sorry.
No.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk about some monitoring that we've conducted over the past 4 to 6 months on the Coonamessett River. Oh, by the way, my name is Casey Kennedy. I work for the USDA. I focus mainly on improving water and nutrient management in commercial bogs, but I've recently been involved in a restoration project in Plymouth on Two Marsh Farms, and so decided to do some similar monitoring on the Coonamessett with their bog restoration. So first, I want to just give you an overview of the site and some of the work that we've conducted and what we plan to do following the restoration of Lower Bog. So these are the 3 bogs: Lower Bog, Middle Bog, and Upper Bog. It's a 1.4 kilometer section of the Coonamessett River from Pond 14 down to the downstream of Lower Bog. There are 2 major surface water inputs to the river: Flax Pond, which flows through a small tributary into Middle Bog, and then Pond 14, which discharges through a fish ladder. And the 3 bogs are roughly the same area, about 4 to 6 hectares. And Lower Bog is currently, as many of you probably know, under restoration, and I have what is the proposed new channel shown here. And so Chris and some of his colleagues at the Woods Hole Research Center have been conducting monitoring for multiple years, since 2005, at the lower end of Lower Bog, so CR6, this site. And this has been stream flow monitoring. And then since 2016, nutrient monitoring has been conducted at CR5. So weekly samples have been collected at CR5 and analyzed for nitrate, ammonium, total dissolved nitrogen, and total nitrogen. I started working on this in the summer, and we started to make flow measurements at the river site. So CR2, CR4, CR5, and CR6. And over the 6 months, we've made 1 to 4 measurements of stream flow at those sites. In addition, we've installed stage or velocity meters at the river sites, except for CR6, because Chris has a gauge at that site. So we've been monitoring stage at the bypass channel, CR2, stage and velocity, stage at the fish ladder, velocity and stage at CR4, velocity stage at CR5. We've also been collecting weekly samples since August at all these sites. Okay, so we have weekly concentrations of nitrogen, including nitrate, ammonium, dissolved nitrogen, and total nitrogen at all these sites. We also include, and I'm going to show you some of these results.
How long have you had them?
August.
These results?
August.
August.
Just since August. Okay.
Yeah, I'll show you, I'll present some of those results. We also conducted a longitudinal survey, collected about 50 samples along the length of the river, the full 1.4 kilometer reach.
Just for clarification, longitudinal survey means you collected them all on the same day, or?
We just along the river, we walked the river. So
But
we have
were
the
they-
spatial distribution of nitrogen concentration along this reach.
Did you do it all on the same day?
Yeah, on the same day.
Did you start at the north end or the south end?
South end. Right? That's important. That's a good question.
Okay.
Yeah, we definitely started at south end.
One other quick, all three of these bogs are no longer commercially active,
That's
Correct.
right.
and that's been that way for several years.
Yes, at least since 2012. That was the last year there was a crop.
So what we're proposing, and we're open to suggestions to continue the monitoring, is continue the weekly sampling at these sites, the river sites, CR6, 5, 4, 2, as well as Pond 14. Continue our stage and velocity monitoring at those same sites. Repeat the longitudinal survey, and this was actually a really interesting piece of the study. I'll show you those results in a bit. So go back and walk the stream the same way we did, collect the samples at the same locations, but after the restoration. Add spring and summer storm monitoring at CR6. So really try to answer the question if we're missing anything during these large storm events. This is a key component. Add velocity area streamflow measurements. So what we want to do is develop a rating curve at these river sites so that we can combine our nitrogen concentration data with flow measurements to determine export. Installation of groundwater wells. We're proposing 3 wells along transects parallel to groundwater flow on either side of Lower Bog, and then one-time sampling of groundwater from those wells, as well as the stream bed and springs, which I'll talk about in a bit. So this is an estimated cost. We can discuss that later, the details of what it would include. So just some basic questions. Does restoration of Lower Bog reduce nitrogen levels in the Clear Mesa River? We hope to answer that question on the short term. There's a great paper in ecological engineering by a woman at Mount Holyoke, Kate Ballantine, that showed over long times buildup of organic matter can facilitate denitrification. So if we don't see it on the short term, we may see it on the long term, and that's an important point. What are the water inputs and nitrogen inputs to and from these 3 bogs? Okay, a very basic fundamental question on an annual scale too. And then what is the groundwater input of nitrogen to Lower Bog? Because one potential outcome may be that the input is so large that it overwhelms any retention following restoration. Okay, so that's something we want to get a better hold on.
Could you say that again?
Well, one of the issues that, so the uptake that may occur in response to the restoration, we may not be able to see that signal if the groundwater input of nitrogen overwhelms it. So there may be so much nitrogen coming up from the groundwater into the reach that we don't actually see the change in the nitrogen in the stream.
Right. Okay.
So we want to get a better hold on what that input is, how much the amount of nitrogen being transferred from ground to the stream.
I wanted to ask about that. Wouldn't the groundwater nitrate also be denitrified though? I mean, are you making an assumption that the stream nitrate is what's going to be denitrified? But I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think we'd be expecting the groundwater nitrate
It
to also.
doesn't matter. You've got all your sources of nitrogen. If you do nothing, they're all gonna wind, correct me if I'm wrong, they're all gonna
Temporary
wind up in Great
increases.
Pond. All that matters is how much of it you take out.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
fungible like money, you don't care what dollars.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
I mean, we were interested, we'd like to know, right, I mean, for purposes of understanding how the system works. But the idea, as I see it, is that, so you've got that river channel that will be restored within Lower Bog now, and a much longer section of it that will be restored in the fairly near future going forward.
You should really be at the microphone.
Okay, I'll join Casey. Okay, so I'm Chris Neal, Woods Hole Research Center. So I just wanted to comment that there are two things, right? So there is, exactly as Sia said, I think that there's nitrate removal that occurs within the channel, and as the restoration goes forward, there's all this good evidence from scientific literature saying that as the channel gets more complex, develops more organic matter, that the denitrification that occurs within the channel itself will go up. And we'd love to be able to document that in this case, put it into your hopper as things that are happening that influence the total delivery of nitrate to Great Pond. If we're just looking now, say over the course of the next year or two, at the restoration in Lower Bog, there's a lot of water coming in at the top and a lot of water going in at the bottom. It doesn't stay there that long. The total amount of denitrification in a lot of water running fairly quickly might be fairly low. It might get higher after the restoration, but it might still be fairly low. But the other piece of this is there's a lot of, and Casey will show you this, a lot of groundwater coming into those bog sections. That water is high in nitrate. That's where in fact, where a lot of the nitrate is coming from. And that could be denitrified as it goes through these reconstructed wetlands, and that could be a very large potential benefit. So the idea is to mass balance the water coming in the groundwater, coming in at the top and the bottom, to be able to say, and to have enough wells to measure the concentration of nitrate coming in the groundwater, to be able to say that the total amount of nitrogen from the two sources was reduced by the sum of the restoration of the channel and the restoration of the wetlands that kind of influence the groundwater as it's coming up. So I think
you have to do an experiment that separates out that surface water from the groundwater.
Well, if we have, I mean, ideally, if you measure the input points and get the volumes, the way you get the volume of groundwater coming in is to measure the gain over that reach, basically. Casey can explain it better than I can.
So Chris, I'm
hydrologist,
looking, I can't get underground and see what's going on, but typically any organic rich environment is going to have very low porosity. And underneath all of this is this extraordinarily porous aquifer that we've got of sand and gravel and everything. And I'm trying to figure out some way we could redirect the water and, force it into contact with the organic matter. But I don't see it offhand, short of some other ideas I have about artificial structures that Steve and I have talked about a little bit about. Anyway, am I seeing that right? I mean, my guess.
That's true. That is, you will have more denitrification in places where there's more organic matter and way less oxygen.
Yep.
The downside is, those are exactly the springs you want in the river for fish.
Right.
So you don't necessarily want to take all of your incoming groundwater and turn it anoxic and run it through, something that some organic matter chamber or something that makes it anoxic.
Right. Well,
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the idea is to look at what would be happening in the way they're constructing this restored wetland system. And there may be some places where water seeps in and goes through small side channels that they're going to construct. We'll have to look exactly to see what emerges from the restoration. They have some plans for places where they collect water and run it in little surface channels. And in fact, there could be lots of uptake in those little surface channels because there's less volume and much more contact with soils and vegetation and organic matter. Right. So the idea is to try to figure that all out, really, in a sort of integrated way with enough sampling of the different pieces to be able to come up with a kind of a real number for the amount of N removal by these different processes.
Right. Could you put the map back up of all your sampling points, and then I have a couple of things to point out. Okay. Two main topics. One is the remnant nitrate from the Ashumet Valley plume is projected to surface in the Coonamessett River. And there is a U.S. Geological report on that. And, okay, there's, okay.
This is lower bog, so yeah, one of the things we did well was the sample on either side of it.
Okay, right.
So that's one of the reasons why we have it on both sides of the bog.
And if you flip back to where you show where your wells are going to be. Okay. So my sense was you need more wells on your, because it's going to come in from the east side. We need more wells to look at that. And it's not only lower bog, it could be coming in through middle bog. So,
Until you see the data.
It's all coming from middle bog.
There does seem to be a lot of nitrate in middle bog.
The issue with the plume though, it's about, the front edge of the plume is 15 meters deep.
Yes.
Based on the model. These wells, I mean, we could do that, but it would increase the budget. These wells are going to be put by hand. I'm not sure we can get them. Just.
Right. Well, the model may say it's 15 meters deep.
Yeah,
but if it surfaces in the river, it's going to surface at a pretty specific point, and that's not.
Yeah.
It's going to be within 2 meters of the surface.
We may not sample it in the wells. Just based on
A plume like that can't cross the river, can it?
No.
So it has to surface.
go in there.
Exactly.
I expect
Well, the river is at groundwater level where it is. So
Yes.
the flow paths should converge on the river channel.
We're going to sample from the stream bed, and I think that's what we'll see.
Okay.
We're going to get groundwater that's seeping up from the sediments. I think that's what we might see.
Well, I'm encouraging your plan to include more monitoring wells, because I think we have a chance, we have an opportunity here. And I'm building off my experience from another plume that surfaced farther up. It was in Broad River, but it's the northern end of
So
Coonamessett.
if I'm interpreting this right, so you'd like us to be able to say, to identify, so like do enough wells to say, okay, there's the plume.
Right.
And here's the concentration, and here's, based on some
Right.
flow estimates, here's maybe the total nitrogen that's coming in.
Right.
But you'll
Exactly.
probably really need to drill to really figure that out.
Well, let's think about what might be involved.
Shallow well. I mean, drilling is. We did drilling in Shorewood. Drilling is not a problem. Okay.
Like geoprobe drilling or just?
Geoprobe drilling. I believe it will be shallow enough so that we'll be able to identify where it is, and we'll also be able to look at the concentration. So, following further on that, because it's surfacing, we want to look at the potential for a permeable reactive barrier on the eastern side along John Parker Road. If there is a concentration that is high enough, we would be injecting the carbon, EVO, that is needed to help basically denitrify before it even gets to the river. Until we know where it is and until we know the concentration, we can't do that. But I see a potential here, town-owned land, distance from the river. What we need is facts and data. The second thing that I wanted to tell you is from my experience with this river. There is a major spring. You see where CR3 is? If you want to give me
right on this side?
No, it's on the right-hand side. And it is, yes, it's about there. But it's in the ditch. It's not in the river. It's in the ditch. And there's so much water coming out of there that it actually flows north.
Yeah, no, I've seen that.
You've seen, oh, okay.
I know exactly what
So,
that was baffling to me. You can see it flowing, it's gushing.
It's gushing.
Wow.
There you go. So in terms of major input to this stream, in my mind, we need to know a little bit more about that particular spring. If there's enough water to make that ditch flow north, upstream, in fact. It would be interesting to know what's the nitrogen concentration from that. is that actually a discharge from pond 14? No? Or is it a discharge from somewhere else? I suspect it's pond 14 because of the volume, but I have no idea.
Well, we're gonna identify springs. We have a thermometer right
Okay.
there that we're gonna use.
You're
to
gonna look for
identify
springs.
and sample them. So
Great.
yeah, we're gonna do it, three different scales of groundwater sampling: the wells, the stream bed, and the springs.
If I could, if that's the case that the discharge from pond 14 goes underground before it
A portion.
comes back,
A portion.
so it's naturally cooled,
Yes.
so there may not be as big a problem with pond 14 if that wears out.
Yes, that's another aspect to knowing this area better.
So just so basic, so this is our monitoring setup. Yeah, this is CR4. So this is the upstream end of Middle Bog. And we have an automatic sampler that we use to collect surface water samples. This is what we'll be using for the storm sampling. An area velocity meter. We also use the sampler to measure stage, which I'll talk a little bit more about. A key component is going to be measuring stream flow. This is a very standard method for measuring stream flow. We use an acoustic Doppler current meter. We divide the stream into 25 cells and measure the area and the velocity for each one of those cells, and then integrate over the width of the stream to calculate stream flow. So we're proposing 10 of these measurements, at least 10 of these measurements at the 4 river sites. Okay. We want to use those measurements with concurrent measurements of stage to develop a rating curve. And rating curves are used to estimate continuous stream flow. So we'll have continuous measurements of stage, and with our measurements of stream flow, we'll be able to estimate the our measurements of stage, we'll be able to measure continuous stream flow. And this is just an example of a rating curve that we've developed in the Weewantic River, just upstream of Horseshoe Dam. And so, again, we're proposing to develop these rating curves for the 4 river sites. This is some work that Chris has been doing. He developed a rating curve at the downstream end of Lower Bog, and this is the stream flow for a year in 2007 with cranberries, and this is the stream flow without cranberries. And one point to note is the variability in the winter months. They apply a flood, as many of you know, in the winter. So you can see the effect of cranberry farming and the stream.
Wait. The cranberries affect the flow?
Yes, because they
Yeah,
dam and then they
flood it,
release.
and then they release the floods.
Oh, but they don't affect the annual flow?
No, I haven't. I mean, not really. At Tinmarsh, we haven't seen any change in stream flow following the restoration.
Can you leave that just
lows and highs.
leave that just 1 minute. So 2007 with cranberries, and 2016 without cranberries, and it was a dry year, but you have a pretty steady flow. Yeah, that's what I would expect.
Yeah, it's not a very flashy system at all, because
Right.
it's almost all groundwater mediated, so.
Exactly.
Not a big difference between peak spring flow and
Right.
summer flow, except there are year-to-year differences based on overall rainfall.
Yeah.
Which would make sense because it's the whole water table going up or down. Okay.
So here's some results from our stream flow measurements. This was done in June. I don't think you can really see the colors that well, but the stream flow this is downstream of the fish ladder, just downstream of the fish ladder. And so the change across upper body is minimal. It goes from about 300 to 325 liters per second. The change over middle bog is dramatic. It's a 41 increase in flow. So there's a lot of groundwater upwelling coming up through middle bog. We saw a slight decrease in lower bog. I really think this is an artifact of this measurement. The river takes a 90-degree turn to the west, and so the stream channel was not ideal. There was a huge fan of sand. I mean, it's somewhat of an imperfect channel for making these measurements. It's also at the location of a dam, so we suspect that there's probably some seepage of surface water underneath the dam. So that's why it was slightly lower. And then at 28, it's around 500 liters per second. So we're seeing the gaining stream flow that's consistent with here is the large increase in groundwater across Middle Bog.
So Casey, just a technical question, the Flax Channel comes into Middle Bog too, so that gain includes...
That includes
the gain from the flax.
Yeah, we've made
Which is
some-
not big.
It's not
No,
big.
it's not
We've
big.
made some measurements on that. It's actually quite small.
Yes.
So this is probably one of the most interesting pictures. This was the longitudinal survey where we walked from the south to the north, took a sample every 30 meters. So you can see the evolution of nitrate downstream along the channel. Okay, so it starts at around 0.5. This is nitrate. This is nitrate concentration. And you can see a dramatic increase in nitrate from Middle Bog, which correlates with the groundwater input that we're seeing with changing the stream.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah.
Well,
pretty
but
amazing.
it's even more fascinating than that, because the volume is going up and the concentration is going up.
Yes,
Well, because it's coming from
yes.
groundwater.
Well, the
This is
concentration
higher
in
nitrate.
the river is consistently between about 0.3 and 0.8 milligrams per liter.
Yeah, but look at your data there. It's just,
But
it's marching
at-
along like
at-
Bolero.
at-
It
at
steadily
Middle
gets
Bog,
up
right?
to...
But you're mixing in groundwater that's probably
Higher.
way higher than that.
Right. Casey, do you have this plotted longitudinally, a graphic?
Yeah, just
Oh,
so,
good.
and this is, you can see these patterns are persistent in time. So this is, these red points are Middle Bog and Lower Bog. And these points right here, these yellow points, yellow and green, it's hard to see, are the bypass channel and the pond. And one thing I want to point out, these squares, these are samples that Chris's colleague collected and analyzed. So we're seeing similar results.
Because those
Collected
were,
independently, run on a different machine. But the point here is that these trends, this high increase in nitrate, is consistent in time. We're seeing a persistence in the spatial patterns of nitrate in Middle Bog. So
It's great that we have this data.
It's one.
It really is.
So this is just talking about some of the groundwater sampling that we plan to conduct. 3 different scales, the groundwater wells, which we need to revisit, maybe a few more wells, longer transects, possibly deeper. But also the groundwater that's actually seeping up through the stream bed.
I'm going to turn the mic towards you a little.
But also the groundwater that's actually discharging through the sediments into the stream. Okay, based on, and we can make some physical measurements to actually calculate the flux of nitrate moving from groundwater into the stream. And also your point about the springs, we're going to use an infrared camera, which we have, to identify the location of these springs and sample them too. So those are 2, this is the nitrate stored in the groundwater with the wells, which we'll sample, but we're also going to measure the nitrate concentration in the discharge, which is actually probably more important.
Can I, just while you're on this picture over here, Chris and I discussed the concept of a horizontal plane permeable reactor barrier.
Right.
That especially while you're moving a river anyway,
Yeah.
which is not normally something you go to the Concom to ask to do, can I move a river up? But when the Concom decides to move a river, you've done 80% of the work. You dig the trench for your new river location a little bit deeper than you would have. You line it with wood chips, and then you proceed. And most of that work, the Concom was going to do anyway.
Is that something you think they'd be amenable to considering?
I think the big issue is there's a lot of emphasis on ultimately having cold water fish and high oxygen water.
Yes.
And in those places where the groundwater emerges through sand and gravel. So if you talk to, Steve Hurley has walked up and down the Quashnet and
Yes.
and the places that the brook trout actually spawn are in that gravel, in the upwelling, oxygenated groundwater. And so the 2 things are at odds with each other.
But where does the oxygen come from in that case?
Well, the groundwater is fairly oxygenated here.
Then why do PRVs work?
Because the wood chips
Create an
decompose and the
oxygen.
bacteria
Yeah, that's what
chomping
we're
on the
doing.
wood chips eat up all the oxygen. So the barrier causes the low oxygen
Yeah.
because of the decomposition of the wood
And
chips.
it kicks out that rusty.
And then it has to re-oxygenate and precipitate any
Yeah,
iron that it's picked up.
So it'd be
That's
oxidate-
exactly
it
what
might
the
be
PRV
oxidate,
is.
you know, in
It-
some distance down, but I think for the nitrate removal, you know, the closer to the coast or the closer to a river you put the barrier, the bigger the bang for your buck, because you intercept most of the water.
And again, there's the issue, as I mentioned before, when you've got a lot of organic matter, your porosity goes down, and I don't understand what physics would push the water up through that nearly at the rate that you're seeing now.
The
It'd be like a
springs.
sort of a cork.
Well, that's an issue that we've seen with the barriers installed along the shorelines already.
Yes.
Is that in some cases, some water continues to go through, but
Right.
there's some evidence, I think, that water is sort of pushed around, especially the one on the Childs River, that the water just ends up going around it,
Yep.
you know, after,
That's my guess.
either right after it's installed or after some period of time.
Yeah.
And that in this case, it might be much worse because you might be putting it into a more sandy, gravelly place.
Yep.
Where all of a sudden it's of course it forms films and clogs.
Yep.
Not completely, but permeability probably goes
It
down.
could.
So I think the biggest conflict I see is with taking oxygen out of the upwelling springs in places that are highly valued for.
And the other
some
thing too is those
wildlife
springs are
purposes.
important during the winter also. The coldest months of the winter too, in terms of fish survival.
Yeah.
How far away do the PRBs have to be so that you don't get this undesirable effect?
100
At least
feet.
100 feet.
You'd be
That-
digging
that
down
would
pretty
be-
deep.
That would be good.
Do you agree with that?
I don't really know.
You'd be interested in West Falmouth Harbor, we used a drone in the winter when there was ice on the harbor to see where the springs were appearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll show you some images from Pennsylvania. I have a project in Pennsylvania.
Yes. I've been out in February when everything is frozen and it's very obvious to tell where the springs are. There's also a man-dug pond in Middle Bog on the west side, and that never freezes,
know.
never
Seen
freezes
that.
over. The ducks are there. That's where they are in the winter.
Seen that.
Well, the great blue herons also, all along.
I was just telling my technician.
They can overwinter there because
Just looking at that, because after these tales, you gotta.
It's
So
fascinating.
Matt Charette, who's not here, but
Right.
he actually helped the Coonamessett River Trust and did a little project that did thermal imaging over the whole system just this last spring. And, sort of identified some of these areas that we've already identified, but the hope was that those areas of upwelling could then be incorporated into the future restorations where you make a little channel to
Yes.
capture that and draw it into the river to both create habitat and lower the temperature.
Right. Great.
This would be at our disposal, that we could use in a variety of ways.
Okay.
So, I mean, we basically discussed this idea that there's a plume on the east side of the bog that we want to sample, try to sample at least, and I just mentioned that the front edge of the plume is 10 to 15 meters deep. We're proposing to put the wells at 6 to 9 meters deep,
Okay.
so.
But that's just from the modeling. It says.
That's
what
just
it
from
is.
the modeling.
Yes. Okay.
I'm not
No.
sure what I'm looking at. Is this the same scale of the whole river
This
system?
is.
Or is
yeah,
it just
so
near
this is
one
This is
bog?
Lower Bog right here. This is the location of Lower Bog.
And
And then
where's the
Middle
river?
Bog?
Middle Bog's right
E
here.
and F, maybe?
I mean, the whole system is right around here.
Oh, that's the whole.
Where does the river go though, when you go up?
Goes out here.
Yeah, right.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
so this is over to the right of the river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so is that Coonamessett Pond by E?
Yes.
Oh, I see, so
Things
the
you
plume
can't
is so much
see.
bigger.
So this is all the way from
This
the
is
source.
Yeah.
This is nitrate from the
base,
wastewater
right?
treatment plant at the base.
Mhm. It's a whopper.
I forgot how dramatic that was.
Oh, and that's the end of it. In other words, that whole slug is moving
Yeah.
south and
Yes.
eventually will be gone.
Yes.
Eventually.
It'd be nice to
Yes.
catch that at the mouth of the river.
Yes.
Casey, how deep is the top of the plume, at its closest point to the river? How far below grade?
I
Says-
estimate, and it's just a graphical estimate, but it was 10 to 15 meters below the surface.
So 45 feet.
And it's
kind of a crude, I mean, I don't know how accurate this delineation is.
Well, you know the horizontal direction of, what, is it moving mainly south?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the groundwater is moving mainly south. It's not moving across into the river.
Okay.
It's moving parallel to the river.
Yes and no.
Yep.
It's moving. There has to be some flow to the river. Whether, I mean, I would be very surprised if none of the nitrate actually was discharged into the river. I mean, certainly if you go back to this, the shallow paths will discharge the river. It's possible that the deeper ones, the more deeper regional flows.
Because that makes a huge difference in the number of years till it's all gone. You'd really like it to go sideways into the river and get out of there.
Yeah, it's not
If it
doing
just
that.
goes
I mean, the
next to the river, it'll take forever.
Yeah, the primary direction of flow is south.
It seems that would explain why some of the upwelling is so high in nitrogen, because it's going down and probably hitting it.
Well, it'll be really interesting to see our stream bed measurements. We're going to do transects along the stream bed and really see if there's patterns. Like, is the east side a lot higher the stream
Yeah.
bed, groundwater in the stream bed?
Yes.
Because if this is true, you'd expect it to be much higher on the east side of the stream bed, which would argue to move the channel to the west, maybe.
That's correct. And give you more distance so you can have your
That water,
PRB.
and then that water upwells through the
It works.
the wetland.
So Virginia, are you talking about putting the PRB to capture the plume?
There certainly is a portion of the Shuma plume that will surface in the Coonamessett River over a period of years,
Right.
decades. And as it gets about ready to surface, it will be fairly shallow, and that's your opportunity.
Right, but if you look at our numbers for the controllable load, the estimate, that plume is 2%.
Yeah, I know.
But it's capturing the regional groundwater is what is.
Right, it's not treating just the plume. It will be other
That's
things.
what I'm thinking about.
But, so all of, at this point, we're talking really big picture, but you have a really exciting program that you've outlined here. And I can see that it has some other ramifications that we could scoop into it. And then once the data is there, then we can say, yeah, this has possibility, or no, it doesn't. So that's why.
Knowing the groundwater concentration is critical. And that's.
Right, I like Virginia's suggestion of more of these. The shallow wells are relatively straightforward and easy to, anything you can pound by hand is relatively straightforward.
But for
like
$2,000, we had a geoprobe do those
a day worth of wells.
Shorewood. They went down 70 feet. 80 was the max. So we include that idea.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, add a day of geoprobe, right?
I mean, the wells I was going to install myself.
Yeah, I understand.
So-
Thank you.
We like doing that, but it was relief from office work.
Well, the other way to do that is have graduate students, because they'll do anything.
So this is just an example of some of the stream bed measurements we make. This is a probe, goes down 30 centimeters. We collect a sample of this range, and there's a manometer to measure the force of the groundwater coming up, and then a permeameter, which we can measure the permeability of the sediments. So based on these three measurements, the permeability, the hydraulic head gradient, and the concentration, we can get a flux. So we can actually flux kilograms per day of nitrate from groundwater to the stream. And then this is just an example of some of the thermal camera work. This is a stream in Pennsylvania that I've been working on, and there's seeps everywhere. This is just an example of the seep. This is the stream. It's hard to tell from this image, but you can see that the seep, this is a groundwater seep, a riparian groundwater seep, has a much higher temperature. We can identify that with the camera. So the idea is to use the camera, identify these springs and sample them for their nitrogen concentration. So we'll get a nitrogen concentration of the groundwater coming up through the sediments as well as through the seeps. So just a summary, develop rating curves for the stream sites so we can estimate an export as well as the nitrogen concentration in the stream. Install the wells at different scales. We're going to have to revisit that, probably deeper wells, maybe a few more, especially on that east side of the bog. We're going to be able to estimate
annual inputs and outputs of water and nitrogen from each one of these bogs. Okay, so we will be able to develop budgets, nitrogen budgets coming in and out of the bogs. And based on some estimates, we're requesting 24K. This probably is going to go up a little bit with the deeper wells, but this is open to debate, or sorry, open for discussion.
That was what I was just gonna ask. Where's your funding coming from? Is that why you're here?
Partly to say this would be an interesting
Yeah.
thing to do if you're interested in
Okay.
the whole concept.
Can we have a one-page with a price tag for our next meeting?
Yeah, sure. Well, what we thought we could do would be incorporate suggestions
Right.
Where are you gonna come in?
and produce it in the form that you want.
Are you finished? Because I have two questions that are relevant. Well, they're questions. I didn't want to interrupt you. Assuming you get the funding tonight, which you won't, when would you have the data?
It's a year-long study,
Okay.
so we wanted to go full year from starting April
And-
1 after the restoration.
Starting when?
April 1 after the
April 1?
restoration.
So the restoration of Lower Bog is slated to be finished in March.
Mark, yeah.
So something,
Yeah.
something on those.
So this was a post-restoration study.
And I didn't mean you wouldn't get your funding, I just meant obviously.
No,
tonight.
that's a very good question. So if we sample over, I mean, it takes a little bit of time to run the samples in the lab and analyze the data, so
Yeah, okay. Well, and
if
then-
you want a sampling period for 1 year, then you need, several months after that, not
Yeah.
half a year, but 3 months or something, to just get everything.
And then the other part, as Chris knows, there was a small group from this committee that was interested in what we called synthetic constructed wetlands. We did, and Ken Foreman and a student did some experiments. And the bottom line of all that was that the residence time needs to be so big, that the volume needs to be so big, that anything of reasonable size would make a minuscule contribution to the nitrogen coming in through the Coonamessett River. And so I think we agreed that any restoration, making it slightly zigzag, is small compared to what we had in mind for the synthetic constructed wetlands. And I'm not arguing, I'm not trying to re-argue the synthetic constructed wetlands, but I'm saying that all these things are great for the fish and so on, all this restoration. But have you done any back-of-the-envelope calculation of what in your wildest reasonable dreams you'd remove and expect the data to show the removal will be?
So I did do a back-of-the-envelope calculation that if you could denitrify several percent, 5 would be a wild dream, perhaps. That would be, forget exactly how many kilograms, but it was about the equivalent. It was about.
It's less than 5%.
Well, yes, you're not going to. I mean, you can't make a giant bioreactor out of 300 liters per second that's there for a matter of an hour or two.
Right.
With just as reasonable, not consistent with habitat
Some
restoration.
people from the citizens who were here for the first half of the meeting may have the idea that, that there's this magic bullet. Oh, let's wait in the river restoration, and then we can cut the number of sewers in half. No way.
No, but as Casey pointed out, there's very solid evidence that the more of the river channel you do, and the more organic matter, and the more structure, and the more eddies and passive storage zones that you put into a river, the more denitrification you're going to get. But I think it's an open question.
Yeah, the one limitation of that study is they didn't find any nitrate in the soils. A lot of bogs don't have nitrate. That's what was attractive to the Coonamessett River to me, is that there's a lot of nitrate. A lot of bogs, the runoff is organic.
Yeah. If I take a 5-gallon pail over there tonight, take out 5 gallons in Port and Vineyard Sound, I've removed some nitrogen, but numbers matter in making decisions about whether you use sewers or IAs and how many.
Right, but think of the river system, and think of the plans for the river system going forward. You're doing more of the river there's a very significant amount of groundwater that enters into the river between Pond 14 and even think above Pond 14 that someday as those bogs naturalize. So if you could deal with the water coming in, it's not the reaction, it's not a reactor in the channel, it's that a little bit, but it's also a reactor of how that groundwater is processed as it comes into a more naturalized system.
Right, but I didn't want the idea left there that just what Concom is doing now, even extended to the whole river, will have a significant percentage-wise effect. Unless you think that unless you use the word significant to include numbers less than 5%.
No, I'm saying 5% in the river channel. I'm saying the big unknown is what happens in the groundwater that's coming in, and whether the system will perform as a naturalized system, can take out more nitrogen than it is taking out now, or whether other modifications to the restoration plan could be made that would somehow enhance that. I don't know how exactly those would work or how to put a number on that very effectively.
Casey or Chris, is any data comparable to this up in Plymouth? There's been a couple rivers.
I haven't worked it up. I have 4 years of data from Titmarsh.
Okay, it would.
I can have that.
Yeah, it would be fantastic because that's the closest thing we've got right now to the real world.
Titmarsh looks a lot like Middlebach.
Yeah.
It's wide.
Yeah.
It's really slow. It's weedy.
Yeah.
So yeah, when I saw that, I was like, okay, it's
Well, in your proposal, be sure to include as much as you can about nitrogen removal, because that's why we're here.
That's our part of the game.
I'm working up this data right now.
Fine.
Okay.
Can you spell Titmarsh?
TIDMAR.
TAD.
All right. Any further comments or questions for the visiting scientists? No? If not, thank you. We'll look forward to receiving a more specific written request.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
And quick items on the agenda. One very important one, to fund the ScienceWare's 2018 contract discussion and vote.
Shall I recuse myself, or?
You can sit, but don't talk.
I'll take notes.
I'll make the motion. ScienceWares has a 3-year contract with the town to provide us with technical services, but the funding for each year needs to be a separate vote that's sent recommendation to the selectmen. So I'll move, it's the same terms as this existing year. For calendar 2018, $78,000 to be paid out of Article 17.
Second.
Discussion? Yeah.
No.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? You guys have it. Report of members and staff. I guess not. Vote the minutes of the prior meeting. They were all sent around.
Yeah.
This is for November 2nd. Any additions or corrections? Okay, I entertain a motion.
I move that they be accepted as written.
Second.
Second.
That's right. Discussion?
No,
Okay, all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? You guys have it? One more motion.
Motion to adjourn.
I'll move to adjourn.
No, wait. I want to thank the Enterprise for doing such a thorough job of reporting the last meeting, the West Falmouth monitoring wells and all.
Yes.
I thought you did a super job of
Yes.
staying on top of it and all, because it, as you know, it's complicated.
I would second that. It's
Yeah.
very hard stuff
Yeah,
to figure out.
very good.
And you managed to write it up in a very clear, compelling way that.
Thank you. I enjoy covering this committee. You get a lot done. And a short amount of time usually.
Not today, as you can see, but.
Mr. Chair, next meeting date, we might want to.
Good point.
Yeah.
All right, we usually do this on the first and third Thursdays. Well, there's one more Thursday on the 30th, and then we move into the 7th.
I think we should do regular, December 7th and
Well, that means the next one will be the 21st.
21st. Well, wait.
I won't be here. I'm
On the
leaving
7th?
town on the 21st, so
okay.
not that that's key, but
We could meet on the, well, then
30th.
that's 2 weeks in a row.
Yeah.
Well, we could do the 30th and 2 weeks from the 30th, the 13th or
But
something.
you've got
No,
three
we don't want
people
to.
who aren't here.
Yes.
So you may want to do it
Right.
by email and figure it
That's
out
true. Why
later.
don't
Yeah,
we
let's-
send this out and ask people
Okay.
Yeah.
what works for them? All right, we've moved to adjourn. Did we vote to adjourn?
Yes,
I
we
moved.
did.
You
There
moved?
needs to be
We
a
voted?
second.
I thought
Okay.
we did. Thank you.
Now you're adjourned.
Now we're.